I hit him, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. Those are the words of the defendant 4 times. You heard testimony from 4 different witnesses who overheard and observed those statements from the defendant on January 29th, 2022. You heard testimony from firefighter Timothy Nuttall. He was trying to bag, valve mask Mr. O'Keefe. He was working on resuscitative efforts to try to save Mr. O'Keefe's life. He asked if anyone saw anything or knew what happened, and the defendant said, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him, I hit him. Firefighter Anthony Flamati was asking if anyone had information on why Mr. O'Keefe was there in the snow. The defendant repeatedly said, I hit him, I hit him, oh my God, I hit him. Firefighter Katie McLaughlin was tasked by firefighter Flamati with asking for biographical information and for what the cause was of the traumatic injuries that all the firefighters testified that they observed on Mr. O'Keefe. She asked the defendant, and the defendant said, I hit him, repeatedly. Firefighter McLaughlin asked for clarification. You did what? And the defendant repeated, I hit him. Jennifer McCabe stated initially over the phone when speaking with the defendant that the defendant said, could I have hit him in the car while they're on the phone with Ms. Roberts going from Ms. McCabe's house to Mr. O'Keefe's house? Did I hit him? Could I have hit him? Once on scene, once asked, as Ms. McCabe described by an EMT, for name, age, things like that related to Mr. O'Keefe, what caused the trauma? She indicated in her testimony that the defendant said repeatedly, I hit him. You heard testimony from Officer Saraf, statements that he attributed to the defendant as saying that morning, this is all my fault. This is all my fault. I did this. This is what the defendant is saying on scene. Since then, stories changed a little bit. But those were the words that came from the defendant's mouth on January 29, 2022, as John O'Keefe lay dying on the front lawn of 34 Fairview Road, where the defendant had left him after striking him with her motor vehicle several hours before, and then left him freezing there in a blizzard. There's certain things that have come up over the course of this trial as far as evidence and testimony are concerned, little things. And what I would suggest to you is it's those little things that are quite telling as it pertains to the defendant's statements and the defendant's actions over the course of January 28th and January 29th and beyond. I'm going to bring some of those to your attention as I go through, but just ask you to keep that in mind as far as when you're deliberating, when you're reviewing this testimony and this evidence. The little things matter. The little things start piling up in this case. Throughout the course of this trial, you've heard a lot of purported evidence or questions of witnesses in an attempt to distract you from the evidence in this case. It's essentially defense by obfuscation. It's a 3-card money trick. Facts and the evidence in this case are your card, they're the Queen of Hearts. And so what I want you to, or what the defense wants you to do is not look at that card. Look at anything else. Look at movement, look at this person, look at that person, look at text messages, look at this. Don't pay attention to the facts and the evidence, because if you do, what it will ineluctably lead you to is that the defendant is guilty of each of the 3 indictments before this court. The evidence and the facts of this case are for you, the jury, to decide. Using your common sense, using your life experiences as your guide through that as you go. Before I turn to that evidence that I will submit to you ineluctably demonstrates the defendant's guilt, let me first just address Trooper Proctor. The text messages from Trooper Proctor are unprofessional, they're indefensible, they're inexcusable. However, as distasteful as those messages are, and their content is, I submit they had no bearing whatsoever or impact whatsoever on the integrity of the entirety of the investigation that Massachusetts State Police collectively conducted into John O'Keefe's death here. As was asked of Trooper Proctor on cross-examination, these were texts from his personal phone. that he never thought would see the light of day. He was asked whether or not he ever thought that he would be asked about these in a courtroom. Put to him in sort of a safe space, a safe place for him to discuss, if you will. What do you not see in those text messages? You don't see any discussion or any illusion of any conspiracy, of any framing of the defendant, of any planting of any evidence. No evidence whatsoever. Why? Because it didn't happen. There is no conspiracy. There is no cover-up. There is no evidence of any of that beyond speculation, rampant speculation and conjecture on behalf of the defense. Two things can be true at the same time. They're mutually exclusive. The texts from Trooper Proctor are distasteful, they're disrespectful, they're unprofessional. There is no defense to them. And the defendant killed John O'Keefe. Turning to the evidence, let me first talk a little bit about John O'Keefe. You heard a lot about him over the course of this trial, about his selfless story through his family and friends that loved him, including his adopted niece and nephew. You heard a lot about the lives he touched and the different people who he had friendships with. You heard a lot about from those particular friends and from his family. Turning to what I would submit to you as a timeline. This may be a little hard to see up here. What I'm going to go is from left to right. January 28th, 2022, 9:49 in the morning, Karen and John begin fighting over text messages. 2:25 p.m. in the afternoon, the defendant texts Mr. O'Keefe, "Tell me if you are interested in someone else. Can't think of any other reason you've been like this." John texts back, "Nope." 2:25, Mr. O'Keefe texts the defendant, "Things haven't been great between us for a while. Ever consider that?" This is also testimony that you heard through multiple sources, whether it be phones, whether it be from the children, whether it be from other friends or family members as to the relationship in the months and weeks leading up to John's murder. 2:32 p.m. John texts the defendant, "Sick of always arguing and fighting. It's been weekly for several months now." He then texts the defendant, "OMG, stop calling." This is during the time frame that Trooper Garino was talking about, with 18 phone calls, most of which were rejected, some of which were missed, and a couple of which were answered over the course of this afternoon, as she's continuing to needle and try to engage him in a fight that he doesn't want to have. 2:33 p.m. The defendant texts John, "So you're not into this anymore." 2:34 p.m. John texts the defendant, "I am not answering, stop calling." The defendant then texts John, "Then stop starting with me." 2:38 p.m. The defendant texts John, "I'm going to grab a drink in a bit." 2:38 in the afternoon. Around 3 p.m. is the testimony you heard from Erin O'Keefe in regard to the defendant texting her, asking if she can go out without her husband, Paul, asking him to go out for a drink. This is while Erin O'Keefe testified she was waiting for one of her children at the bus stop, picking that child up around 3 o'clock in the afternoon. This is also the point at which the defendant says to Ms. O'Keefe, "Wish I didn't speak to another O'Keefe after 2004. 7:30 p.m., you have Mr. O'Keefe and Mr. Camerano arriving at C.F. McCarthy's, with the defendant arriving at 8:51. 8:58 p.m. is when the defendant receives drink number 1 at C.F. McCarthy's. Vodka soda, tall cylinder glass, lime, and a strong. 9:13 p.m., drink number 2. 9:20 p.m., drink number 3. 9:33 p.m., drink number 4. 9:57 p.m., drink number 5. 10:22 p.m., drink number 6. 10:29 p.m., drink number 7. 7 drinks from 8:58 p.m. through 10:29 p.m. when she receives that last drink at C.F. McCarthy's. A drink that she indicates to Sergeant Mechanic and several others on the next day that she did not take with her from C.F. McCarthy's to the waterfall, which several individuals at the waterfall testify that she produced from her coat when she walked in, and that you can clearly see on the C.F. McCarthy's video her walking out the door with the same tall cylinder glass in her right hand. Now, keeping understanding that some of these drinks are not the full tall cylinder drinks, what she's doing is she's getting shot glasses of vodka and then pouring them into the drink after she's consumed the drink. 10:54 p.m. The defendant and Mr. O'Keefe arrive at the waterfall, during the course of which, on an hour that they're there, the defendant receives drinks number 8 and drinks number 9. 12:10 a.m. From the waterfall video, you have Ms. McCabe, Ms. Kolakithis, and the defendant departing the waterfall together. Interestingly, around the same time, you also have the text and screenshot communications between Colin Albert and Allison McCabe in reference to him getting picked up at that time. You also have testimony from Brian Albert, Nicole Albert, Caitlin Albert, Brian Albert Jr. in reference to them sort of walking in from the waterfall as Colin Albert is walking out of 34 Fairview Road, gets picked up by Ms. McCabe, and then is driven home. 1 minute later, 12:11, Mr. O'Keefe is then on the waterfall video walking out with cocktail glass in his right hand. At 12:14 a.m., Mr. O'Keefe texts Ms. McCabe, "Where to?" 12:14 a.m., based on the fact that she's driving, and Mme. McCabe indicated in his testimony that she should call him instead of texting while driving, Ms. McCabe calls John O'Keefe. Speaks with him regarding directions, sort of going over which way to come in, Chapman Street, over Cedar Crest, as far as coming into Fairview Road. 12:15:38 a.m., the defendant's vehicle drives by the Canton Library. You can see that on the video. 12:17:56, the defendant drives by the Temple Beth Abraham video. Again, you can see that on the video. Remember also the testimony from Lieutenant Tully in regard to the CSLI data and the ranging data in reference to it coinciding with what you observed, the black SUV, from each of those respective videos. 12:19:32, Mr. O'Keefe enters 34 Fairview Road into his Waze app on his phone. 12:23 a.m. is when the defendant conducts a 3-point turn on Cedar Crest and travels back toward Fairview. That's from Mr. O'Keefe's GPS native location data from his phone. Around the same time at 12:23 and 12:24 is when you have that testimony from Ryan Nagel, Heather Maxson, and Ricky D'Antono pulling into Fairview Road around the same time and pulling in behind the dark SUV. 12:25 a.m. is the last native location GPS data of John O'Keefe's phone. It's in that area between 32 and 34 Fairview Road, where his body is discovered the next morning, in which there is no movement of that phone from that 12:25 a.m. period until Ms. Roberts then picks up the phone on the grass underneath Mr. O'Keefe's body sometime after 6 a.m. What you have up on the screen right now is that data, those plotting points that Trooper Garino was testifying about as far as the movement of the vehicle. The movement of the vehicle as it comes down Cedar Crest, passes by Fairview, reverses direction, and then comes down Fairview, moving up, moving up, moving up, as the witnesses described, eventually stopping in that area of the property line between 32 and 34 Fairview Road, which happens to coincide with the vehicle control history database information from the Toyota tech stream, which you now have up on the screen before you here, indicating that following that 3-point turn, approximately 8 minutes after that, from Trooper Paul's testimony, as far as the mileage, 36 to 38 miles, matching up with the time that the vehicle is in front of 34 Fairview Road, that the vehicle travels in reverse, in a straight line, with 24.2 miles per hour for 62.5 feet, with a minor steering angle change, which the trooper indicated was consistent with a pedestrian collision. At 12:30 a.m., you have that second triggering event 8 minutes after the 3-point turn when the vehicle is in reverse at 24.2 miles an hour. 12:35 is when the defendant calls John, and that's unanswered. 12:36 is around the time that the defendant's phone connects to the Wi-Fi at 1 Meadows Ave, Mr. O'Keefe's home. 12:37 is when the defendant leaves this voicemail. So within minutes of that vehicle's data, going 24.2 miles an hour in reverse for 62.5 feet. The defendant leaves that voicemail, seething in rage as she's screaming, "John, I fucking hate you." 12:40 to 12:42. Ms. McCabe is texting Mr. O'Keefe. She tries calling Mr. O'Keefe, gets no answer. If you recall from her testimony around this time frame, about 12:40, she was unsure whether the vehicle was actually still out front or if it had gone at that point. But she was looking for John because she had seen the defendant's vehicle in front of the house and no one had come in. So she was wondering where her friend, Mr. O'Keefe, was. 12:55. The defendant texts John, "See you later." 12:59. The defendant calls, leaves another voicemail for Mr. O'Keefe. Exhibit 637. It sounded like this.
"John, I'm here with your fucking kids. Nobody knows what the fuck you are, you fucking pervert."
But somebody did know where Mr. O'Keefe was. The defendant knew exactly where he was. She had driven him there. She had struck him there. She had left him to die there. 1:02 a.m., the defendant leaves another voicemail with no content. And then she texts John, "Your kids are fucking alone." 1:09 a.m., the defendant texts John, "I'm back in Mansfield. The kids are home alone." She's not. GPS, as far as it never disconnects from the Wi-Fi until the following morning. There's no indication that Ms. Reed left and went to her home in Mansfield at any point. 1:10 a.m., the defendant calls her parents. 1:11 a.m., she calls Mr. O'Keefe and leaves this voicemail.
"John, I'm going home. I cannot babysit Amy. I need to go home. You are fucking using me right now. You're fucking another girl. He's sleeping next to me. You're a fucking loser. Fuck yourself."
1:18 a.m., the defendant leaves another voicemail. Now, about 1:43 or 1:45 a.m. is when Julie Nagel testified that they were leaving the house. And she sees a large black object on the lawn near the flagpole while leaving 34 Fairview Road. Doesn't think much of it at the time, isn't expecting Mr. O'Keefe or any body to be out on the front lawn. 4:42 a.m. The defendant calls and speaks. So the calls to her parents are finally answered. 4:49 a.m. The defendant calls Ms. Camerano, screaming, "Where's Mike?" 4:53 in the morning is when the defendant instructs Kaylee, Mr. O'Keefe's niece, to call Ms. McCabe. Why? Because the defendant doesn't have Ms. McCabe's phone number. Indicates that John didn't come home. We got in a fight, and I left him at the waterfall. Those are the first statements or the first version of events that she's able to communicate out to the world as to what happened to Mr. O'Keefe and where he is. We got into a fight. I left him at the waterfall. 5 a.m., the defendant calls Kerry Roberts, saying, "John's dead, Kerry, hangs up the phone. 5:01, the defendant calls Kerry Roberts again. And it's at this point that she indicates that John's dead, he must have been hit by a plow. 5:07 a.m., the defendant leaves One Meadows Ave. You have the video of that. It's number 153 in Exhibit 6. We'll get to that a little more in a moment. About 5:10 a.m., the defendant calls Kerry Roberts. Ms. Roberts starts calling hospitals, calling KPD, calling 911. Something that you would do if you didn't know where Mr. O'Keefe was for all of these hours, that all of these other phone calls are being made and these text messages are being sent and calling your parents and all of these other things. No calls to 911 from the defendant. While John O'Keefe is laying, freezing, and dying from a brain injury and a skull fracture on the front lawn of 34 Fairview Road. 5:11 a.m., the defendant's vehicle is seen on the Canton Library camera heading towards the waterfall. Seems to be sort of retracing steps. 5:18 a.m., the defendant's vehicle is seen at Washington Street in Chapman on the Temple Beth Abraham video, heading in the same direction that it was the night before when it was heading to 34 Fairview Road. 5:35 is when the defendant arrives at Ms. McCabe's house. Ms. Roberts arrives shortly thereafter. Both of them see the broken taillight at that time in the driveway. Now that gap of 5:18 to 5:35 is way too much time to be driving from the area of the waterfall to Jennifer McCabe's house. And as I indicated a moment before, heading in the same direction, same directionality, retracing the steps from the night before, heading towards 34 Fairview Road. Why is it that the defendant can see Mr. O'Keefe when they eventually get to Fairview Road and no one else can? It's because she knew exactly where he was. She had hit him and left him there the night before. And she had gone back during that time frame between 5:18 a.m. when she's seen on the Temple video and 5:35 when she arrives at Ms. McCabe's house. 5:33 is when the defendant, Ms. McCabe, and Ms. Roberts return to One Meadows Ave searching for John. 6:03 is when the defendant, and no one else, spots Mr. O'Keefe's body buried in the snow. Exhibit 12, indicating this cruiser camera video, which I know you've seen a dozen times. So where I'm starting it from this point in this card right here is the spotlight that Officer Saraf had to use in order to locate, even with the vehicle of Ms. Roberts parked right in the middle of the road. In the darkness, in the snow, in the blizzard, in those conditions, the defendant, sitting in the back seat of the vehicle, knows exactly where Mr. O'Keefe is, covered in snow, as you heard from all of the paramedics, from the civilian witnesses, from the first responders. But the defendant knows exactly where he is. 6:07 a.m., Ms. McCabe calls 911. 6:08, the defendant leaves that 4 or 5 minute voicemail, leaving the phone in the car for some reason to Mr. O'Keefe's phone. 6:23 and 6:24 in the morning is when Ms. McCabe conducts those Google searches. 7:50 in the morning is when Mr. O'Keefe is pronounced deceased at Good Samaritan Hospital. 4:13 to 4:20 p.m. is when the defendant's SUV is towed from her parents' house in Dighton. 5:20 p.m. is when the search team arrives in the area of 34 Fairview Road to conduct the search for evidence. 5:30 p.m. is when the defendant's vehicle arrives at the Canton Police Department south. We circle back for a moment to Mr. O'Keefe, to his families, to his friends, and to his relationship with the defendant. We heard testimony from Paul and Aaron O'Keefe that they liked the defendant, that they thought he was good for John, thought he was good for the kids. All outward appearances of the relationship were good. You heard testimony from the children that that was not true behind closed doors. But Paul O'Keefe testified that he told the defendant's parents this, that he liked Ms. Reed, that he thought that she was good for John, thought that she was good for the kids, weeks before John's murder. He even blew her a kiss in the emergency department at Good Samaritan as he was walking out and she was still being treated while they were there. Invited her over to John's house to grieve with him. Invited her to sit down with him while he explained to their nephew Patrick about John's passing. The defendant shows up at the house. Abruptly goes upstairs with her father for a period of about 15 minutes, which is about half of the time that she spent there that morning grieving with the family. She left with a bag of her belongings, drove with her family there, and then took an extra vehicle in the height of the blizzard, around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, drives that vehicle all the way from Canton, where it was parked at her boyfriend's house, where she stayed over on many occasions, drove that vehicle or felt the need to drive that vehicle from Canton all the way down to her parents' house in Dighton at the height of the blizzard. You heard testimony from Aaron O'Keefe of the text messages and the phone call on January 28th. You've heard that Aaron O'Keefe called the defendant on the morning of the 29th because she was concerned for her. She wanted to know what was going on with someone she considered her friend. The defendant yells, "John is dead." Ms. Robertson grabs the phone and then updates Erin O'Keefe as to what's going on with John. Erin O'Keefe again calls back later because she's concerned for someone that she considered her friend. How does the defendant respond? These are some of the little things. The defendant indicates to Ms. O'Keefe that she just has to remember the bad times and indicates to her, "I don't think I'll ever see you guys." This is after she's done her quick in and out at One Meadows Ave and is now with her parents or with her father, driving that car, essentially taking the murder weapon from Canton and bringing it down to her parents' house in Dayton. She's indicating over the phone to Erin O'Keefe, "I don't think I'll ever see you guys." Why? If she didn't kill John, why would she say it? You heard a lot of testimony about New Year's Eve in Aruba. You heard the testimony from Ms. O'Keefe in regard to them exchanging, her and the defendant exchanging text messages on the flight down, arranging times to meet up. And then the defendant telling Erin via text message that she caught Johnny kissing Laura's sister in the hotel lobby. She got into an argument about it, and then they never met up. Meaning the defendant, Mr. O'Keefe, got into an argument about it, and she and Erin O'Keefe never ended up meeting up in Aruba. You heard testimony consistent from Laura Sullivan, Marietta Sullivan, as well as the children. The kiss never happened. It never would happen based on the relationship, the godfather relationship that John O'Keefe had with Laura Sullivan, her family, and particularly Laura Sullivan's child. The defendant persists with this unfounded suspicion and accusations of infidelity in her text messages with Mr. O'Keefe, in her text messages with Mr. Higgins, where she's accusing Mr. O'Keefe of making out in the lobby with Marietta Sullivan. Both of the Sullivans and the children have the defendant and Mr. O'Keefe following this incident with Marietta Sullivan going into a room. Both of the children testified that they're in that room for about 20 to 25 minutes and they're arguing. And they're arguing about the defendant indicating that Mr. O'Keefe kissed someone in the lobby. And you have Laura Sullivan's testimony about 20 to 25 minutes after her sister comes out and states her displeasure about the defendant. It's about 20 to 25 minutes before Mr. O'Keefe comes out. And then he and Ms. Sullivan have a conversation. Ms. Sullivan indicates that Mr. O'Keefe's phone is essentially blowing up, lighting up with calls and texts from the defendant. I would submit similar to the afternoon of January 28th. Mr. O'Keefe says she's crazy and he needs to take this and goes off from her. Ms. Sullivan has later conversations with Mr. O'Keefe on this Aruba trip, asks him if he's okay, asks him if he's happy. She indicated in her testimony that Mr. O'Keefe shrugs it off and says it is what it is. You heard testimony from the children about the arguments in the weeks and the months. And I know this is a displeasure to the defense counsel that the children came in and actually testified as to what happened behind closed doors in the house. They both recall frequent fights. They both recall Mr. O'Keefe trying multiple times to break up with the defendant, asking her to leave the house, the defendant refusing to leave the house. His niece, Kaylee, John tried to diffuse, he tried to walk away, and the defendant would follow each time during each argument. They both indicated that Mr. O'Keefe had told the defendant that the relationship had run its course, similar to language within the text messages you have between the defendant and Mr. O'Keefe. That Mr. O'Keefe was sick of arguing, again, mirroring those text messages from January 28th, leading up into going out to C.F. McCarthy's, eventually the waterfall, and the defendant killing Mr. O'Keefe in the early morning hours of January 29th. We have testimony in regard to the ring camera. Kaylee indicated in her testimony that John had had that for about a year. So during the course of 2 years or so of the relationship with the defendant, he got it while he was dating the defendant. The defendant had the security code for the garage. Neither of the kids had access to the camera. Trooper Garino checked the laptop and the desktop that were left after the defendant did the quick cleanup upstairs with her father, upstairs in the home. Neither of those devices had access to the ring cameras. John had access on his phone. The defendant indicates, if you recall, in some of those text messages in regard to the romantic kiss that she placed on Mr. Higgins earlier on January, whatever it was, during the Patriots game. Mr. Higgins and Mr. Jackson was indicating weren't very good friends with Mr. O'Keefe, but had been invited over to his home for a Patriots game, in which time the defendant escorted Mr. Higgins out of the garage and placed a romantic kiss on him. But during those text messages, when they're talking about that, if you recall, the defendant is saying something or joking about something that Mr. O'Keefe had been looking at the videos and had been asking her if there was something going on with her and Mr. Higgins. And what was her response to that? I know where the cameras are. There are only two videos missing from that ring system. One being the defendant getting to Mr. O'Keefe's house after murdering him, and the other when the defendant is showing Ms. McCabe and Ms. Roberts the broken taillight, both of which, both Ms. McCabe and Ms. Roberts testified as having occurred. No video. There's a variety of stories that the defendant tells on the morning of January 29th. There were text messages and voicemails from the defendant to Mr. O'Keefe, 53 phone calls from 12:33 a.m. to 6:03 a.m. 0 phone calls to 911. The defendant calls Katie Camerano. The defendant calls her parents at 1:18 in the morning, 4:38 in the morning, 4:42 in the morning. The call then from Kaylee's phone to Ms. McCabe, because the defendant didn't have Ms. McCabe's phone number. Both Kaylee and Ms. McCabe indicate that the defendant initially indicates or says that she got into a fight with Mr. O'Keefe and left him at the waterfall. From this information, Ms. McCabe then testifies she starts to call her Julie Albert. Because Chris Albert, Julie Albert, they live close by the waterfall. Maybe that's where he went. As the phone is ringing, this is a phone call that both Ms. Albert and Ms. McCabe testify was never answered. As the phone is ringing, her husband Matthew McCabe reminds her that they saw the defendant and Mr. O'Keefe and the car outside of 34 Fairview. So she hangs up. During this call, or during these subsequent calls, the defendant indicates to Ms. McCabe, maybe I hit him, did I hit him? She then calls Ms. Roberts at 5 a.m. on the dot, indicates John's dead, hangs up the phone, calls back a minute later, indicates that Mr. O'Keefe was now hit by a plow and that he's dead. And then indicates further that she's drunk and doesn't remember. She tells Ms. McCabe about the cracked taillight before they even get in the vehicle and go anywhere, as you recall the testimony of Matthew McCabe, indicating that he has some concerns about them driving around in a vehicle with a damaged taillight in the middle of a blizzard. Ms. Roberts' testimony that she saw the broken taillight in the driveway at Ms. McCabe's house, and that it was consistent with what she observed in the photographs that were shown to her of it later in the Sally Port at the Canton Police Department garage when the search warrant is executed on February 1st. You have the text messages between the defendant and Laura Sullivan from January 29th, in which the defendant indicates to Laura Sullivan that John is dead, indicates that we found him in the snow at 5 a.m. And every indication is that he was found in the snow by the defendant, Mr. McCabe, and Ms. Roberts around 6 a.m. 5 a.m. would be about an hour before. 5 a.m. would be between that time where the defendant is unaccounted for, heading in the direction of 34 Fairview Road, 5:18, 5:35. Little things. The defendant asked Ms. McCabe to Google how long to die in the cold. She did so at 6:23 and 6:24 in the morning. You have the testimony of Ms. Hyde and Mr. Whitford as to SQLite databases, P-list databases, Knowledge C databases, state DB tabs, as far as all of them. Also from Trooper Garino as well. These searches were unequivocally done at 6:23 and 6:24 in the morning and not at 2:27 and 40 seconds in the morning. They were not deleted by a user. That is not what deleted means. Frankly, Mr. Green, the last question that I asked Mr. Green is, was he aware that Cellbrite, and by Cellbrite, the person who designed that being Mr. Whitford, had to alter exactly how their software worked because of people like Mr. Green misinterpreting the data as he did in this case. And what did Mr. Green say? Yes. But those questions as far as how long to die in the cold, I would submit mirror the questions that the defendant asked firefighter Whitley in the back of the ambulance, if you recall those. She asked firefighter Whitley how long to die in the cold without a jacket. She knew how Mr. O'Keefe was dressed. She knew when she left him to die in the cold how he was dressed. The defendant made statements to firefighter Becker that the last time that she saw Mr. O'Keefe, they were in an argument. Again, in the back of the same ambulance as firefighter Whitley. You have testimony from firefighter Woodbury. Same kind of questions. If Mr. O'Keefe could be alive without a jacket. You have the testimony from each of these firefighters as to sort of the vacillating emotional state of the defendant that morning. What you have in the testimony from firefighter Woodbury is that despite all that, there were no tears that he observed from the defendant at that time. What each of those first responders indicated is that the defendant repeatedly stated, is he dead? Is he dead? Not, is he okay? Is he going to be okay? How is he? Any sort of questions about the medical condition. Is he dead? That phraseology repeated over and over and over again. And when you take into juxtaposition that phraseology, text to Laura Sullivan, found him in the snow at 5 a.m. The unaccounted for time heading in the direction of 34 Fairview Road, 5:18 to 5:35. The repeated questioning of firefighter Whitney, firefighter Woodbury, asking Miss McCabe to look up those things in her phone. She's looking for confirmation, is what she's looking for. When she asks over and over again, is he dead? Is he dead? Is he dead? You have the testimony that you heard from Miss McCabe and Miss Roberts. I say them together because as far as these two women were concerned, they did not know each other, really at all. The only time, as they both testified to, that they had ever spent appreciably together prior to January 29, 2022, is when Mr. O'Keefe nicely took them out for sneakers because he had some sort of deal at a Reebok's outlet or something like that to sort of try to pay them back for the help that they provided him and the children. Jennifer with respect to the niece and Kerry with respect to the nephew. But they're both contacted by the defendant in the early morning of January 29th. As Ms. McCabe testified, John was my friend. I love John. He was an amazing guy. At the waterfall, Mr. Alberts said going home to have a drink with his son, Brian Jr., if anyone wants to come. Open invitation to the table. She said to Mr. O'Keefe and the defendant, you guys should come. Both the defendant and the victim indicated that they wanted to come and that they were coming. She describes the phone calls and the text messages that she receives from Mr. O'Keefe that she's providing directions. She indicates she's providing them directions to go down Chapman. She describes how that is. And you've heard this testimony from a couple of different witnesses as far as the steepness as you're going down Chapman, she's going down Fairview of coming off of Chapman. That you first go down a big, steep hill. It flattens out for a little bit, and then you go down a second. 2 hills going down on Chapman. Matching the GPS native location and the health data as far as where Mr. O'Keefe's phone is, a half mile away from 34 Fairview Road at the time that his health data is reporting that he's ascending or descending 3 flights of stairs. You hear the testimony from Ms. McCabe as far as the last time that she spoke to Mr. O'Keefe. And she's still trying to provide directions to Fairview because Mr. O'Keefe has never been there before and neither has the defendant, which is further corroborated in Trooper Garino's testimony as far as the vehicle passing by Fairview and then coming back in on the other side, having to reverse direction. But she's giving directions and she indicates that she uses a house that Mr. O'Keefe will be familiar with, that belonging to Bella or Bella's mom. Bella's mom is an ex-girlfriend for a short period of time, from a long time ago. However, in the defendant's mind, it's so prescient on her mind that she's still talking about it the next morning or later on that morning when she's riding, going towards Fairview Road with Miss Roberts and Miss McCabe in Miss Roberts' car. She's still talking about it at that time. It's that much on her mind. Miss McCabe indicated that she looked out and she saw the vehicle initially in front of the front door, as did Mr. McCabe, as did Brian Albert Jr., as did Julie Nagel, as did Brian Nagel, and the vehicle moved up several times or several spots to where it was then positioned. Initially at some point in front of the door, then it moves up further so that it's in the area of the fire hydrant and the flagpole where Mr. O'Keefe's body was discovered later on that morning, at least by Ms. McCabe and Ms. Roberts, and then moves up further beyond that. And I say that in the sense of it moves up further beyond that with sufficient distance for it to then go in reverse for 62.5 feet at 24.2 miles per hour, striking Mr. O'Keefe and leaving him where he was found later on the 29th. Again, the testimony from Ms. McCabe that about 12:40 when she's texting him, she indicated in her testimony she couldn't be certain if Mr. O'Keefe was still out front or had left at that point. She wakes up to a phone call from John's niece Kaylee at 4:53 in the morning. This is from an 8th grader, 14-year-old girl. That's why she answers the phone at 4:53 in the morning. She then hears the defendant screaming loudly over and over again, "Jen, Jen, Jen. John didn't come home, got in a fight, left him at the waterfall." The variations, the different iterations of that story as it evolves and changes over the course of that morning. Ms. McCabe then indicates to the defendant, "We saw you outside of my sister's house." Then she starts yelling, "Jen, Jen, did I hit him? Could I hit him?" Then they start discussing, or the defendant brings up her cracked tail. Then both Ms. McCabe and Mr. McCabe hear the defendant screaming outside of their home at about 5 o'clock in the morning, or shortly after 5 o'clock in the morning. They go to Mr. O'Keefe's house. And both Ms. McCabe and Ms. Roberts indicates, and you heard this testimony from a number of different witnesses, friends and family of Mr. O'Keefe, that he had a rule, pretty strict rule in his house as far as you take your shoes off when you come in the house. And so what did Ms. McCabe and Ms. Roberts both do when they're entering in that house on January 29th? They take off their boots, they get out in the snow, they take off their boots in the mudroom, and then they walk in. What did they both indicate that the defendant did that morning when she came back to the house? Walked right in with the shoes. You hear that second voicemail. It's after the defendants arrived back at One Meadows Ave, after her phone is reconnected with Mr. O'Keefe's Wi-Fi. And you can hear the footsteps. Part of that may be in the garage, part of that might be in the house. Why is it that the defendant has no issue with wearing shoes in the house when Mr. O'Keefe has that strict rule? Because she knows where he is. She knows it's not an issue, he's not coming home, because she hit him with her SUV, that she left him in the snow. Ms. Roberts and Ms. McCabe are frantically sort of running around the house looking for Mr. O'Keefe. The defendant's not. They then get in the vehicle. They drive back towards Fairview Road. And again, the defendant, from the back seat of the vehicle, immediately sees the defendant, starts pulling and kicking on the door, and runs in sort of a beeline straight over to where Mr. O'Keefe is laying on the front lawn. We have the testimony from Ms. Roberts as far as John's phone. John's phone, when the firefighters pick him up, and you recall several witnesses testifying about that, pick him up on the scoop stretcher and they're bringing him over to the ambulance while they're conducting the resuscitative efforts trying to save Mr. O'Keefe's life. But Ms. Roberts indicated that she observed underneath it, only the phone, but the phone on the grass. On the grass in the area that is completely covered in snow in every other area except under Mr. O'Keefe, which I would submit indicates how long Mr. O'Keefe has been there. Now recall, around 12 o'clock or so is when it starts to snow and it starts to stick a little bit. And you heard all that testimony. And I know it was a lot of testimony about snow and a lot of testimony about weather, but there's a purpose to that. There's a point to that, okay? As far as the grass underneath Mr. O'Keefe's body, where his cell phone was, Ms. Roberts observed some 6 hours later after it starts snowing, is still visible only under Mr. O'Keefe where his body is, which I would submit as evidence to you as to how long he's been there. Now, on top of that, you also have hours of ring videos of the driveway as far as shoveling and Paul O'Keefe and other people snow blowing and shoveling and all those kinds of things. There's a purpose to that as well. If you look at those, if you look at the video of the defendant crashing into Mr. O'Keefe's vehicle at a speed of anywhere from 0 to 5, which even Dr. Wolf would indicate would not cause the damage to the taillight that was observed in this case. You know what you don't see? You don't see snow move off Mr. O'Keefe's vehicle when they come into contact. You don't see any red or clear plastic pieces in the snow. And if you look at those stills, not the ones that counsel put up there during his closing, but if you look at each of the video and the stills, you can see the damage consistent with the taillight at each and every point. You see the damage consistent with the taillight from the 507 video. You see the damage consistent from the 822 video from Lieutenant Ray, from the cruiser camera video when he's pulling into the driveway. You see the damage consistent from the Dighton video at the defendant's home. You see the damage consistent from the right here, February 1st, 2022, when the search warrant is conducted, Ms. Hartnett removes all those pieces from the vehicle. The weather is also important when it comes to the hair. The magic hair, as Mr. Jackson likes to call it. See, the magic hair was actually frozen to the vehicle, as was the glass to the bumper, because the vehicle looked like that on the left when it was caked in snow, when Officer Barrow saw it in the driveway in Dighton as they were wading through 1.5 feet of snow, walking up, because remember they didn't even pull into the driveway because they had to have someone come down and plow it before they could get into it. That's what the vehicle looked like. What you can see, however, is the damage to the taillight, to the side of that taillight, consistent with it. So that hair, that 7/8 of an inch hair, was frozen to the side. And as you remember, the testimony from Sergeant Buchanan about the heated condition of the Canton Police Department garage, and that's one of the reasons that they took it there, because the other barracks that they could have taken it to didn't have that heated condition. So yes, after it's been in there from January 29th at about 5:30 p.m. until February 1st when they conduct the search warrant, the hair isn't still frozen as it's contained within heated garage, and the pieces of glass on the rear bumper have melted. The snow has melted, as you can see from left to right. The weather, also important, I would submit, weather was a weapon. Remember, the cause of death here is not just blunt impact injuries, it's blunt impact injuries and hypothermia. You heard all that medical testimony in relation to it, and you heard all that testimony in relation to the snow and the weather and the wind. Wind gusts up to 37 miles per hour while he's out, Mr. O'Keefe is out there in just a shirt and jeans. Now, you heard also testimony from Ms. Roberts in relation to the injuries she observed to Mr. O'Keefe. That initially on scene, there was one eye that was swollen, not the other. That's indication of the swelling that Dr. Scorti-Bella was testifying to, with no indication of physical altercation. And then both eyes being swollen when Ms. Roberts viewed Mr. O'Keefe's body after his passing at the Good Samaritan. Submit that all the testimony tells you the same consistent account, internally, externally, from civilian testimony to investigator testimony to medical testimony to forensic testimony to the reconstruction testimony. You have the testimony from Ms. McCabe and Ms. Roberts that they couldn't see Mr. O'Keefe at Fairview when they initially pulled up. You can see that from Officer Sarif's cruiser. You have Mr. O'Keefe being covered in snow from the storm. You know where Mr. O'Keefe's body was. It's clearly visible on the cruiser camera from Officer Sarif. You have the testimony from each of the responding officers, anywhere from 5 to 12 feet off the roadway, and from the civilians as well. Ms. McCabe, Ms. Roberts, Officer Mullaney has 6 inches of snow on Mr. O'Keefe when he first sees him. Firefighter Kelly says that he couldn't even see Mr. O'Keefe until he was 5 feet away, in the darkness, in the snow, in the blizzard conditions. There's no footprints around the body. There's no drag marks around the body. There's no evidence of anything in relation to Brian Albert and Brian Higgins. Brian Albert and Brian Higgins spent January 28, 2022, traveling to New York City to go to a funeral for another police officer, for another department, who they didn't even know. Traveled all the way down to New York and then came back before the blizzard, only to come back from that to go out drinking, to come back to Mr. Albert's house, to then murder another police officer who they did know, who worked for the same department as them. And then criminal mastermind genius that Brian Albert is, 28 years on the Boston Police Department, he's then going to just leave Mr. O'Keefe's body on his front lawn? Really? That's the conspiracy? What evidence do you have of that? You have statements that the defendant made to Sergeant Buchanan on January 29th. She was willing to speak, but didn't want to give too much detail. Conversational tone throughout. She indicated that the night before, they had gotten into an argument, something about what was fed to the children, nothing about the detailed arguments and incessant phone calls and everything else that you saw from the defendant and Mr. O'Keefe's phone on the 28th. She indicated that she got to C.F. McCarthy's around 9 p.m., started drinking vodka sodas, the men were drinking beers. When asked where she parked her vehicle, she said she parked on Washington Street across from C.F. McCarthy's, facing northbound on the side, same side as Waterfall. Same testimony that you heard from Ms. Kolakithis, observing the defendant going over to her vehicle, getting in the driver's seat, and the victim, Mr. O'Keefe, getting into the passenger seat. She said they were left the Waterfall, were invited to her residence. She drove her and John to the location in Canton. She dropped Mr. O'Keefe off, did not see him walk into the home. She, being the defendant, stated she made a 3-point turn and then left. When asked about the damage to her vehicle, she indicated to the troopers, "I don't know, it happened last night." June 2022, you have that other recording of that other version that she now has evolved into as far as stating to Sergeant Buchanan, "Are you aware that John was beaten up by Brian and Colin Albert? We're all in on the same joke, right? John was pulverized and my taillight was cracked." What evidence do you have of that? Mr. O'Keefe never went in the house. You have testimony from Nicole Albert, Brian Albert, Jennifer McCabe, Matthew McCabe, Caitlin Albert, Brian Albert Jr., Sarah Levinson, Julie Nagel, all indicating never went in the house. John O'Keefe's phone never went in the house from the testimony and the data points that you have from Trooper Green. You know how Mr. O'Keefe was dressed, and you know the defendant knew that. You have the testimony from Kurt Roberts, Jennifer McCabe, Matthew McCabe, Karina Kolakithis, Nicholas Kolakithis, Brian Albert, Nicole Albert, Brian Higgins, all indicated in their testimony, and the defendant knew, based on her questions to the firefighters the next morning, that Mr. O'Keefe was not dressed for the weather when he left the Waterfall. The weather was a weapon. You have the testimony about the car, the defendant's car being there in front of the house, moving multiple times. You have that from multiple sources. You have that from Matthew McCabe. You have that from Jennifer McCabe. You have that from Brian Albert Jr. You have that from Julie Nagel. You have that from Ryan Nagel. You have the testimony of Ryan Nagel, Ricky D'Antonio, and Heather Maxson. Ms. Maxson indicated she saw a male passenger, female operator as the vehicle was turned. Remember, they're coming towards Fairview at the same time. The defendant, after conducting that reverse, a 3-point turn on Cedar Crest, is then taking a right onto Fairview, while Mr. Nagel, Mr. D'Antonio, and Ms. Maxson are taking the left onto Fairview. Mr. Nagel indicates that Mr. D'Antonio then flashes lights. During that time, Ms. Maxson can see inside the vehicle. She sees a male passenger. She sees a female operator. They follow the vehicle as they're turning onto the street. Lo and behold, they're going to the same residence. They park. There's nothing in between them and the defendant's vehicle. They indicate that at no time do they see anybody get out of the vehicle. At no time do they see any damage to the vehicle, or it hasn't happened yet. At no time do they see anyone leave the vehicle and go into the house. The vehicle moves up on different successive occasions, as testified to by Mr. Nagel and several others. And then as they're passing that vehicle, Mr. Nagel indicates that he sees a female operator in the vehicle with the dome light on. Interesting, when I asked Mr. Nagel, as far as when Julie Nagel came out to the vehicle, did he roll down the window or did he open the door? He indicated he opened the door. And I asked him, what happened when you open the door? What happens when you open the door to a vehicle? The dome light comes on. So there's a reason I would submit, or the inference that you can make, is that no one sees Mr. O'Keefe in the vehicle because that's the moment he steps out of the vehicle. And then they're gone. The Nagels, Ryan Nagel, Ricky D'Antonio, and Heather Maxson drive away from that. We have the testimony from Julie Nagel and Sarah Levinson, the peanut butter and jelly sandwich conversation they have with Ms. McCabe, which while they're pulling away from the house where everybody's attention is drawn, Ms. McCabe is turned around facing both of them in the backseat. Ms. Nagel is facing Ms. Levinson on the passenger side, looking out the window towards 34 Fairview Road. Ms. Levinson is looking back at Ms. Nagel away from that area, in which Ms. Nagel indicates that she sees a 5 to 6 foot dark blob on the lawn near the pole in the hydrant, which is just where Mr. O'Keefe is discovered the next morning. You have the testimony, recall, and you have text messages in regard to Colin Albert when he gets picked up from home.
Mr. Lally, 5 minutes.
Yes, sir. Colin Albert, Allison McKay, Brian Albert, Nicole Albert, Caitlin Albert, Brian Jr., all indicating that it was picked up around that time at 12:10 a.m. You have the testimony from Chris and Julie Albert, his parents, as far as when he comes home, kisses them goodnight before he goes to bed. You have that testimony in regard to Chris Albert, as far as how John O'Keefe and the defendant come to be at the waterfall in the first place, as far as John O'Keefe and his nephew coming in early in the day, getting a couple slices of pizza, what are you doing later on, contained within those texts. You have the testimony from Lieutenant O'Hara, Lieutenant Tully, Sergeant Mechanic, about those items being recovered. And in particular, the items being recovered on January 29th by that search. What did Lieutenant O'Hara say? The items were found close to the curb. The items were at ground level. 3 feet of snow that they had to sift through in order to find those particular things. The detail or the delay in the recovery of evidence. The photos in the video, most of which you have in evidence, is earlier in the storm. This is before the 18 inches of snow falls down, before there's drifts and 3 feet of snow in places. They found the evidence where it had been at that same ground level, in the grass, under the snow, at 34 Fairview Road. We heard all of the medical testimony, which I would submit is consistent, from firefighter Formati to Dr. Rice. We heard the testimony regarding the defendant's blood alcohol concentration from Dr. Fowler and Nick Roberts, 93 milligrams per deciliter, 0.07 to 0.08% at 9:08 in the morning. We heard it, Mr. Roberts' testimony in regard to the retrograde extrapolation, 0.13 to 0.29, extrapolating back to the time of the operation. The defendant admits to drinking vodka. It's on the receipts from C.F. McCarthy's and from the waterfall. And you have the witness testimony in the surveillance video in regard to it. The forensic testimony that you have. In regard to the medical testimony, you have the sort of pattern abrasions, clear plastic that's recovered by Lieutenant O'Hara and Lieutenant Tully on January 29th. The clear plastic that has the dimples on it. No one, not Trooper Paul, not anyone at any point in time ever said that Mr. O'Keefe's arm was out like this at the time that he struck and that he did a pirouette and then flew 30 feet in the air. 12 inches of abrasions that the doctors were, the biomechanical people were talking about yesterday, 12 inches and then 6 inches to the tail end, is easily solved by this. And the dimples on his arm are, that I would submit are consistent with the dimples on the tail light cover piece, are right around this area of the elbow. We have testimony in regard to forensics as far as Mr. Porto, Mr. Bradford. John O'Keefe's DNA is on that taillight housing, on the housing. His DNA is there to the exclusion as well of Sergeant Mechanic and Trooper Proctor. Mr. O'Keefe's DNA is on the exterior of the broken drinking glass. Mr. O'Keefe's DNA and only Mr. O'Keefe's DNA is on his clothing and his fingernails, consistent with Dr. Scortibello's testimony that there is no evidence of a fight or an altercation. There's no one else's DNA under his fingernails. There's no one else's DNA on his clothing. You have the testimony from Ms. Hartman, Trooper Paul, as regards to the damage that they observed, the dent, scratches, the 7/8 of an inch hair. You have the testimony from Ms. Chart in regard to the mitochondrial DNA profile from that hair being consistent with the DNA profile of Mr. O'Keefe. You have the testimony from Ms. Valier and Ms. Hanley in regard to the microscopic pieces, 1/16 of an inch by 1/16.
You have 1 minute, Mr. Lally. Wrap it up.
Yes, sir. All consistent with pieces of taillight that are found within his clothing. Ms. Gilman, if I could. 6:05. This is what this vehicle looks like backing up at that speed for approximately that distance. There's another, years and years ago, started practicing in Norfolk County in Braintree, what is now Quincy. I eventually became a far smarter man than myself. Eventually became President of the United States. His name was John Adams. John Adams once wrote, "Facts are stubborn things. And whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of the facts and the evidence." What the constellation of the facts and the evidence ineluctably demonstrate here is that the defendant drove her vehicle in reverse for 24.2 miles per hour for 62 and a half feet, struck Mr. O'Keefe, causing those catastrophic head injuries, leaving him incapacitated and freezing to death.
Mr. Lally, I have to stop you. You've gone over. Okay.
I literally have one sentence.
One sentence I'll give you.
From that facts and that evidence, I would submit ineluctably demonstrates her guilt on each of the indictments before you, and I would ask that you find this. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to allow it.